When choosing a vacation destination, most tourists gravitate toward nature, wildlife parks, serene beaches, or remote getaways, seeking peace in the beauty of the natural world. However, nature is not only breathtaking but also unpredictable and, at times, far more dangerous than the chaos of a bustling city. One such tragedy unfolded in the waters of South Africa, where a family's peaceful getaway took a devastating turn. Join us as we recount the events of that fateful day. The morning sun painted the ocean in streaks of gold as the Thompson family boarded a small tour boat, their excitement mirroring the restless shimmer of the waves. The air was thick with the scent of salt, and the rhythmic crashing of distant surf against the shore filled the air with a steady, soothing hum. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the vast blue sky. It was the kind of day that felt untouched by anything but beauty, where danger seemed like a distant concept that happened in stories, never in moments like these. Rachel and Mark had planned this trip for months, eager to give their children, Emma and Luke, an adventure to remember. South Africa's coastline was breathtaking, and its waters were teeming with life. They had chosen this boat tour specifically to snorkel in the warm shallows. The captain assured them it was safe. The reefs were full of vibrant fish, and the water was clear and inviting. There was nothing to fear. They anchored a short distance from shore, where the sea stretched in endless rolling swells. The sunburnt guide gestured toward the designated snorkeling area, calm turquoise water framed by distant cliffs. With the reassurance of safety, the family eagerly prepared, slipping into wetsuits, adjusting their masks. When they finally entered the water, the cool embrace of the ocean was refreshing, its vastness exhilarating rather than intimidating. Rachel was the first to drift further from the boat, drawn by the sight of a school of shimmering fish flickering in the sunlight below. The water was so clear she could see the sandy bottom far beneath her, dotted with coral and dark patches of seaweed swaying with the currents. She floated effortlessly, listening to the muffled sounds of her breathing through the snorkel, lulled by the slow, hypnotic movement of the water. She never saw it. 18 feet of raw muscle and power cut through the depths, its shadow merging seamlessly with the blue abyss below. The great white shark had been circling for some time, drawn by the vibrations, by the erratic splashing of unfamiliar bodies in its domain. It had not attacked immediately. It had studied, it had waited, and now it struck. The force was unimaginable. Rachel never even had the chance to scream. The impact sent shockwaves through the water as the shark's massive jaws closed around her torso, its serrated teeth carving effortlessly through flesh and bone. The water exploded in a bloom of red as her body was wrenched violently downward, the world above slipping away in a blur of churning bubbles and blood. Mark turned just in time to see his wife disappear beneath the waves. For a moment, his mind refused to process what had just happened. And then instinct took over. He lunged forward, kicking hard, his arms outstretched as if he could pull her back from the abyss. The shark was already turning. Rachel was still locked in its grip, her body limp, but the predator's hunger was not sated. It released her momentarily, repositioning its jaws for another bite, and in that instant, Mark reached her. His hands closed around her wrist, his mind screaming for this not to be real, for this nightmare to snap back into the idyllic morning it had been just moments ago. Then the shadow moved again. The shark surged upward with terrifying speed, its mouth gaping. Mark had no time to react before it slammed into him, knocking him back. For a heartbeat, he was weightless, and the impact sent him tumbling through the water. But the predator was relentless. The second bite took him. Its jaws locked around his leg, yanking him downward with terrifying power. The pain was instant, searing, but the force was worse. The feeling of being utterly powerless against something so massive, so unstoppable. He thrashed, his vision filling with the murky, blood-filled water, his lungs already burning from lack of air. But there was no fighting this. The shark twisted, its powerful body rolling, and Mark felt the sickening snap before he even registered the agony. From the surface, Emma and Luke saw none of this. They only saw the spreading red in the water. Their mother was gone. Their father was disappearing. The world was collapsing around them. Panic overtook reason as they thrashed toward the boat, their hands grasping at empty water. The guide shouted and waved for them to swim and move fast, but terror had already made them clumsy. Their splashing was frantic and erratic, and that was what sealed their fate. The shark, still in a feeding frenzy, sensed the vibrations, the chaotic energy of struggling prey. It abandoned what remained of Mark, its black, lifeless eyes locking onto the next target. Emma was the first to feel it. A sudden crushing force around her waist, the world tilting as she was ripped beneath the waves. There was no time for thought, only the raw, primal understanding that she was being taken. She reached out unquestioningly, her fingers grazing Luke's outstretched hand for the briefest second before she was yanked away, her body vanishing into the dark. Luke's scream was lost in the roar of the ocean. He spun wildly, his eyes darting in every direction, searching for her, for anything, but the water was empty. Emma was gone. Then it was his turn. The massive head emerged from below, the shark's jaws snapping closed with unthinkable power. The last thing he saw was the sun, distorted through the water's surface, shimmering like a fading memory. The ocean returned to silence. By the time the rescue boats arrived, the carnage was already over. The water was eerily still, and the only evidence of the horror that had unfolded was a few shredded pieces of wetsuit drifting in the current. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just a vast, endless sea stretching toward the horizon as if nothing had happened. The shark had vanished, retreating into the deep, its hunger satisfied. Its behavior was illogical, without cruelty or malice. It was just nature, unfeeling and absolute. The Thompsons were gone. Their names filled headlines, their tragedy retold in warning tales of the dangers lurking beneath the waves. But the ocean doesn't even remember them. The morning waves rolled in smooth and glassy, the perfect swell for surfers to wake before dawn and race toward the ocean, boards in hand. The sky was clear and the Australian sun was warm despite the early hour, casting golden streaks over the vast blue. Seagulls drifted lazily overhead, their cries carried by the light breeze. The salty air mixed with the scent of sunscreen and seaweed, the familiar aroma of endless summer days. Jake Holloway had been surfing since he was 10, carving through waves with the ease of someone with salt water in his veins. At 16, the ocean was his second home, where time slowed, where nothing mattered but the next set rolling in. He paddled out, his arms slicing through the cool water, the rhythmic motion as natural as breathing. Out past the breakers, he straddled his board, waiting, watching, reading the ocean as he had done countless times before. The beach was only a hazy stretch of golden sand behind him, the distant hum of tourists and families barely registering. He felt the pull of the current, the rise and fall of the water beneath him, the anticipation of the next perfect wave. The sea was alive, shifting, restless. He could sense it, but what he didn't sense, what no one ever sensed until it was too late, was what lurked beneath. The bull shark had been moving through the shallows, drawn by the stir of activity, by the vibrations of paddling arms and kicking legs. It was built for ambush, a hunter sculpted by millions of years of evolution, its muscular body cutting through the water with silent precision. Unlike the great white, which often struck from below in powerful lunges, the bull shark preferred direct attacks, hitting its prey with sudden bone-crushing force. Jake never saw it coming. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. One moment he was weightless on his board, the next he was underwater, yanked down in a violent blur of bubbles and chaos. The pressure on his leg was unbearable, a crushing, searing agony as the shark's jaws clamped onto his thigh, its serrated teeth sawing through flesh. His mind barely had time to process what was happening before survival instincts kicked in. His hands flew to the source of the pain, reaching, pushing, fighting. The water around him was thick with blood, a dark cloud billowing in the shifting current. The shark's grip was iron, unyielding, pulling him deeper, rolling with him, trying to drown him before finishing the job. Jake's lungs screamed for air and his vision blurred with the sting of salt and blood. He struck out blindly, his fists hammering against the shark's rough snout, his blows weak against the predator's sheer power. The shark twisted, thrashing violently, its muscular body whipping through the water with deadly force. Desperation fueled him. His fingers scrambled against the creature's slick skin, finding its gills, soft, vulnerable slits just behind its massive head. He dug in with everything he had, his nails scraping, clawing. The response was instant. The shark recoiled, its grip loosening just enough. Jake tore himself free. The pain was blinding. His leg was shredded, hot pulses of agony searing through his body as he kicked hard, propelling himself upward toward the distant shimmer of sunlight. His chest burned, his lungs aching for air as he broke the surface in a gasping, desperate gulp. The shore had never seemed so far. His board was floating nearby, drifting in the blood-streaked water. He lunged for it, his arms shaking, muscles screaming in protest. Climbing onto it felt impossible. His body weakened, the adrenaline barely keeping him from collapsing. But he forced himself up, sprawled across the deck, his fingers clawing at the waxed surface. Then he paddled. Every stroke sent fresh waves of pain lancing through his leg, the torn flesh trailing ribbons of red in his wake. He could feel the weight of the ocean pulling at him, the eerie, lingering fear that the shark was still there, still circling, still hungry. But there was no time to look back. He focused only on the beach, on the people who were just beginning to notice something was wrong. The last few meters were the hardest. His strength was draining, his arms were trembling, and his vision dimmed at the edges. The shallows welcomed him with soft, rolling waves, the water thinning beneath him as he reached the sand. Strong hands suddenly grabbed him, pulling him onto the shore, and voices rose in urgent panic. Towels wrapped tightly around his leg, pressing down, trying to stop the blood. The pain was unbearable now, no longer masked by the chaos of the fight. His body felt cold despite the heat, a deep, bone-deep exhaustion settling in. His head lolled back against the sand, his chest heaving. The sky above was impossibly blue, the sun warm against his skin. Then darkness. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and gauze, and the steady beep of monitors were the first sounds registered when he woke. The surgeons had worked for hours, fighting to save his leg, to repair the damage done by the shark's crushing bite. They had succeeded, but the scars would remain. Jagged, deep reminders of the battle he had fought beneath the waves. Recovery was slow and agonizing. Every movement reminded him of the moment his world had turned red, of the sheer force of nature he had faced. The fear lingered, creeping into his dreams, filling them with phantom pain and the suffocating press of water. But the ocean still called to him. Months later, he stood at the water's edge again, his board under his arm, the waves rolling in as they always had, indifferent to what had happened. The scars on his leg were still raw, a roadmap of survival carved into his skin. He ran his fingers over them absently, feeling the raised ridges, the uneven texture. The fear was there, but so was something else. Respect. The shark had been doing what it was meant to do. It hadn't been personal. It had been instinct, survival, and he had survived too. The water felt the same as before, cool, familiar, endless. He paddled out, his strokes strong, steady, cutting through the surface with the ease of someone who belonged there. The past could not erase the love he had for the ocean. It was his world too. The sky above Queensland, Australia, stretched wide and endless, a brilliant blue without a single cloud to break its expanse. The afternoon sun shimmered over the Pacific, where the water sparkled like crushed glass. Jason Reed soared high above it all, strapped into his paragliding harness, the colorful parachute billowing above him. The ocean stretched out below, vast and inviting, its gentle swells rolling toward the golden shoreline. It had been a perfect day, one of those rare moments that felt almost surreal, as if the world had paused to grant him this single, weightless experience. The wind carried him effortlessly, lifting him higher one moment, dipping him slightly the next. Below, tiny figures gathered along the beach, their heads tilted upward, watching as he floated against the sky. The resort had promised an unforgettable experience, and it had delivered. Jason had never felt more alive than he did in that moment, high above the waves, the salty air filling his lungs. The world laid out before him in every direction. Then, the wind shifted. It wasn't a gradual change, not a subtle shift in currents that he could adjust to. It came suddenly, violently, a powerful gust that sent his parachute to the side. His body jerked in the harness, his stomach twisting as he felt himself being dragged downward. The calm, steady ride turned into a wild descent, his feet skimming the air as he plummeted closer to the waves. From the shore, spectators gasped as the parachute struggled against the shifting air. The colorful canopy buckled and flapped, unable to hold its shape. Jason yanked at the control lines to correct and steady himself, but the wind had other plans. He was no longer in control. The ocean rushed toward him closer and closer, the waves no longer distant and serene but immediate and menacing. The partially inflated parachute dragged behind him, its trailing rope skimming the water's surface. The struggle of fabric against waves created a chaotic spray, the parachute's colors thrashing wildly, as if it were a wounded creature caught in the sea's grip. Then the water exploded. It happened so fast that those watching from the shore barely registered the shape emerging from the deep. A monstrous, sleek, white form shot from beneath the surface, its powerful body slicing through the air with terrifying precision. The sunlight caught the ridges of its snout, the black, lifeless eyes, and the massive, gaping jaws lined with rows of jagged teeth. Jason had no time to react. The great white shark struck like a missile, its momentum carrying it upward in a perfect, calculated attack. The force was beyond comprehension when its jaws clamped onto his leg. A brutal, crushing pressure enveloped him. And then he was no longer descending. He was being ripped sideways, torn from the harness as if he weighed nothing at all. His body wrenched violently as the harness snapped, the sudden shift sending a sickening jolt through every nerve. Pain erupted in his leg, unbearable and deep, as the shark's teeth punctured flesh and crushed bone with ease. His mind barely had time to process the agony before the two of them, the predator and its prey, were airborne together, still rising as the sheer force of the attack carried them further into the sky. For a fraction of a second he was weightless, suspended between the sea and sky, trapped in the impossible moment of horror. Blood sprayed in the air, misting the sunlight with a crimson haze. The shark's body twisted mid-air, muscles coiling in perfect, deadly synchronization. Then gravity reclaimed them. They crashed into the ocean, the impact sending a towering wave outward from where they struck. The water swallowed them whole, closing over them like the surface had never been disturbed. The ocean, once so inviting, had become a battleground of survival. Jason barely knew which way was up. His ears rang from the impact, his vision blurred by the churning water and the cloud of his blood. The shark had not let go. It dragged him deeper, twisting its massive body in a ferocious attempt to tear him apart. His limbs flailed, instinct forcing him to fight, but the strength in his body was nothing compared to the monstrous force latched onto him. The shark shook its head violently, the movement sending shockwaves of pain through his shattered leg. The pressure was unbearable, his body wrenched in directions never meant to bend. Darkness surrounded him, the light above growing fainter as he was pulled into the depths. His lungs burned and his mind screamed for oxygen, but there was none. Only the sea's crushing force and the predator's relentless pull. Above, the spectators stood frozen, the cheers of moments ago now replaced by horrified silence. The parachute, still adrift, floated on the water's surface, its once bright colors now marred by streaks of red. Rescue boats launched from the shore, slicing through the waves at full speed. Their engines roared as they raced toward the spot where Jason had vanished. The water was still bubbling with the remnants of the violent struggle below, but the ocean gave no answers. The minutes stretched on. The boats circled, their crews scanning the surface for any sign of movement, any glimpse of a body breaking through the waves. There was nothing. Only the wreckage of the parachute remained, its torn fabric drifting aimlessly, tugged by the tide. The once bustling shoreline had fallen silent, the weight of what had just unfolded pressing down on everyone who had witnessed it. Jason Reed was gone. The great white had disappeared into the abyss, retreating with its prize to the silent, endless blue. As it always did, the ocean swallowed the struggle, smoothing over the chaos until it was as if nothing had ever happened. The rescue boats remained on the water long after hope had faded, searching, waiting, though they knew nothing was left to find. The Pacific stretched endlessly before him, a rolling expanse of blue that held both beauty and danger in its depths. Evan Carter floated just below the surface, body weightless in the warm Hawaiian waters, the sunlight dancing in fractured ribbons across the ocean floor. The rhythmic pull of the tide rocked him slightly, but he remained still, waiting. His heartbeat slowed, and his focus sharpened. He was spearfishing, a discipline that demanded patience and precision. The world above faded away. All that mattered was the silent hunt beneath. The morning had been calm and the conditions were perfect. The sea was clear, offering visibility for nearly 60 feet. Fish darted below in shimmering schools, their scales glinting like slivers of silver as they twisted and turned in synchronized movements. Evan had been diving for nearly an hour, his stringer already heavy with his catch. A good day's work. But as he adjusted his grip on his spear gun and prepared to make one last dive, something changed in the water. It was initially subtle, just a feeling, a whisper of movement in the periphery. The fish, once abundant and lively, scattered in an instant. The reef, once alive with color and motion, fell unnervingly still. Evan's instincts flared, his pulse spiking despite his controlled breathing. He turned slowly, scanning the deep blue, and then he saw it. A tiger shark, massive and unmistakable, emerged from the depths like a ghost. It moved with an eerie, effortless grace, its broad head swaying slightly as it closed the distance between them. Evan exhaled slowly through his nose, willing himself to stay calm. It wasn't unusual to encounter sharks while spearfishing, and most of the time they were more curious than aggressive. But this one was different. It wasn't just investigating, it was hunting. The fish on his stringer, that was the problem. The scent of blood had called the predator from the deep, and now it had found the source. Evan started moving toward the surface, keeping his eyes locked on the approaching shark. It was big, at least 12 feet, its striped body rippling as it closed the distance with unnerving speed. He tightened his grip on the spear gun. He had to get to the boat. Then, without warning, the shark attacked. A sudden surge of power, a burst of movement, and it was on him. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. Teeth sank into his arm, crushing muscle and bone with terrifying force. Pain erupted through his body, white-hot and all-consuming. The world tilted as he was yanked downward, water rushing past his face, his blood billowing in a dark, expanding cloud. Instinct took over. His free hand scrabbled against the shark's rough hide, fingers grasping for anything to fight back. His vision blurred as he struggled, the need for oxygen burning in his lungs like fire. The pressure increased as the shark dragged him deeper, its powerful tail propelling them into the abyss. Evan fought with everything he had, his body twisted, legs kicking furiously against the pull. The weight of his spear gun was still in his hand, and in a desperate surge of motion he drove it forward. The tip of the gun slammed into the shark's eye socket, a brutal, forceful strike. The reaction was instant. The shark thrashed violently, releasing its grip just long enough for Evan to tear himself free. He didn't hesitate. Pain screamed through his body, but survival drowned out everything else. He kicked hard, his legs burning as he fought to reach the surface. The light above seemed impossibly far away. The world blurred, black edges creeping into his vision. His lungs convulsed, his body demanding air he didn't have. But he kept going. Stroke after stroke, desperate and wild, pushing through the agony, through the blood, through the terror. Then air. He broke the surface with a gasp, lungs seizing as he sucked in the life-saving oxygen. His vision swam, the sky blindingly bright. The boat was close. His diving partner was already reaching for him, strong hands grabbing his shredded wetsuit, hauling him aboard. The pain in his arm was excruciating now, his blood pooling across the deck, staining the white fiberglass in deep crimson streaks. The wound was horrific. Flesh torn, muscle shredded, bone possibly exposed. His wetsuit clung in tatters to the ruined limb. He pressed his good hand against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, but it was everywhere, dripping from his fingers, pooling beneath him, soaking into the deck. The adrenaline kept him upright, but the edges of his vision wavered, threatening to pull him into unconsciousness. The boat roared to life, the engine straining as it sped toward shore. Every second stretched endlessly, each wave jarring his injured body, sending fresh waves of agony through his shredded arm. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, his breath ragged, his vision tunneling. The world blurred between reality and fading consciousness. But one thought remained clear. He was alive. The next hours were a haze, the rush to shore. The paramedics were waiting at the dock. The blinding hospital lights, the whirlwind of doctors, the sharp sting of needles, the suffocating weight of pain. Time folded in on itself, days slipping past in a blur of medication and surgery. The damage was extensive. Nerve damage, torn tendons, bone fractures. The surgeons fought to save the arm, working for hours to repair the devastation the shark had left behind. And they succeeded, just barely. The road to recovery was long and agonizing. Every movement was a battle, every physical therapy session a war. The strength that had once been second nature was gone, and rebuilding it was a slow, grueling process. But he fought. Months passed. The scars healed, though they would never fade completely. Once nearly taken by the sea, his arm regained function, though it would never be the same. The ocean still called to him, the pull of the deep still strong, but he knew now more than ever what waited in the depths. The first light of morning stretched across the South African coastline, casting a golden hue over the rolling surf. The steady and unbroken tide moved with an ancient rhythm, whispering across the shore where David Miller stood, his feet sinking slightly into the cool, damp sand. He breathed deeply, the crisp scent of salt filling his lungs, the air tinged with the faint cries of distant gulls. Behind him, his wife Lisa sat cross-legged on a beach towel, her fingers absent-mindedly smoothing the fabric as she watched their two children, still bundled in blankets, rubbing the sleep from their eyes. The morning held a quiet stillness, untouched by the rush of the day. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, a vast expanse of shifting blues and greens, its surface rippling beneath the gentle breeze. It had always been like this, calm, inviting, and deceptively serene. David had spent much of his life by the water, drawn to its vastness, its mystery. Even now he felt the same childlike thrill he had known in summers past, those endless days of body surfing, salt drying on his skin, and waves carrying him weightlessly toward the shore. Without hesitation he stepped forward, feeling the cool embrace of the sea around his ankles. The sand shifted beneath his feet as he waded deeper, the water rising past his knees and then his waist. A shiver ran through him, but he welcomed it, pushing further into the surf. The waves rolled toward him, lifting his body and carrying him forward before gently setting him down again. It was a feeling he had always loved. Weightlessness, surrendering to the tide. Farther out, where the water darkened, an unseen predator moved. The great white shark, 18 feet of muscle and instinct, glided effortlessly through the depths. It had been hunting just beyond the reef, following the scent of seals, its black eyes scanning the endless blue. But now something new had entered its domain. Something large, moving differently than its usual prey. The vibrations pulsing through the water. The unfamiliar scent, enough to stir something deep within the creature's ancient instincts. David continued forward, reveling in the freedom of the open water. He floated momentarily, letting the tide gently rock him, oblivious to the presence below. The great white adjusted its course, its movement slow, deliberate, circling beneath the surface. It could sense the thrumming of a heartbeat, the pulse of blood moving through fragile veins. There was no hesitation, no malice, only the unrelenting force of nature at work. The shark coiled, its powerful tail propelling it upward, closing the distance between itself and the figure above. Lisa glanced up from where she sat on the beach, her gaze shifting toward the water. An unease flickered into her chest, though she couldn't find its source. David was still visible, his form bobbing among the waves, his arms outstretched as he drifted with the tide. But something felt off. Before she could fully process the thought, the ocean erupted in an explosion of white foam and red spray. The impact was devastating, a violent collision of flesh and force. One moment David was there, his body rising with the waves. The next he was airborne, lifted clear of the water as the shark struck with terrifying speed. A guttural, instinctive scream tore through Lisa's throat as she watched her husband's body twist violently, his limbs flailing. Then, in an instant, the sea swallowed him whole. Pain, unlike anything he had ever known, seared through David's body as the shark's jaws clamped down, serrated teeth puncturing deep into his waist. His mind barely had time to register what was happening before the creature shook him with brutal force. A sickening crunch reverberated through his frame, ribs snapping like dry twigs beneath the pressure. The ocean around him turned red, warm, and thick, clouding his vision as he thrashed against the immense power pulling him downward. His muscles screamed for him to fight, but the pain was blinding, suffocating. His lungs burned, his throat raw from the salt water rushing in. The shark adjusted its grip, releasing for the briefest second before biting down again, dragging him deeper. Instinct kicked in, the primal urge to survive overpowering the agony. His arms shot upward, fingers clawing at the water, reaching for the surface. Above, Lisa and the children stood frozen, horror locking their bodies in place. Lifeguards sprinted down the shoreline, their movements frantic, their shouts barely audible over the crash of waves. People gathered, drawn by the commotion, their voices rising in panicked murmurs. But no one could do anything. For one brief, fleeting moment, David's head broke the surface. His chest convulsed, muscles spasming as he gasped for air, his mouth filling with salt and blood. The sun glared at him, impossibly bright, the world above so close yet utterly unreachable. His arms shot skyward, fingers stretching desperately toward life, toward the air, toward Lisa and the children watching helplessly from the shore. Then the shark yanked him under in a single fluid motion. The force was inescapable, a pull of raw, unyielding power. Darkness consumed him as the water grew colder and heavier. His body screamed for oxygen. His chest tightened as he convulsed against the inevitable. Above him, the sun became a distorted shimmer, a warped, unreachable dream. His hand, still reaching, still pleading, was the last thing to disappear. Lisa saw the final glimpse of his fingers before they slipped beneath the surface and were swallowed by the vast, indifferent sea. The lifeguards dove into the water, their strokes sharp and powerful, but they knew. They knew even before they reached the spot where the water had turned crimson. No struggle left, no desperate splashing, no sign of him. Only the retreating shadow below, a massive form vanishing into the abyss, its hunger sated, its presence leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Lisa collapsed to her knees, the sand biting into her skin, but she didn't feel it. The children clung to her, their faces streaked with tears, their small hands shaking as they buried themselves against her. The ocean stretched before them, unfeeling, endless. The waves rolled in and out, washing away the evidence of what had happened as if the sea wished to erase the moment. Minutes passed, then an hour. The rescue boats combed the water and the lifeguards scoured the shoreline, but nothing happened. There was no trace, only the empty horizon, stretching endlessly, uncaring. By midday, the beach had been closed, and the once bustling shore was now eerily silent. Tourists lingered in uneasy clusters, speaking in hushed, fearful tones, their eyes flickering toward the water as if expecting the monster to rise again. The story spread quickly. A man had been taken and vanished into the depths. Another grim reminder of nature's raw, unmerciful power. Lisa and the children remained on the beach long after the crowd had gone, their eyes locked on the horizon. The tide came and went, the waves lapping gently at the sand, ignorant of their grief. The sun arced across the sky, unbothered by the tragedy that had unfolded beneath its light, and the great white moved on somewhere deep, where the water was cold and eternal. The afternoon sun hung low in the Florida sky on September 18, 2023, casting long streaks of light over the calm water. The ocean stretched endlessly around Carl Peterson's small fishing boat, rippling gently as the tide pulled lazily beneath him. It had been an uneventful morning of casting lines and waiting, but Carl didn't mind. He had always enjoyed the solitude of the sea, the slow rhythm of the waves against the hull, and the occasional tug on his fishing rod, which kept him hopeful. His friend Mark sat at the opposite end of the boat, dozing lightly under the shade of his cap. They had been out for hours, the heat pressing down on them, the kind of sticky, unrelenting warmth that made even a sip of beer refreshing. Carl removed his hat and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. A sudden gust of wind swept across the water, catching the fabric and yanking it from his fingers. He reached, but it was gone instantly, tumbling end over end before landing with a soft plop on the surface. He stared at it momentarily, floating a few feet away, the familiar dark green brim bobbing on the gentle swells. That hat had been with him for years, his lucky fishing hat, which he wore on every trip. He knew he shouldn't care so much about a piece of fabric, but sentimentality had its way of creeping into the smallest things. Without hesitation, Carl stood and swung his legs over the side of the boat. He barely thought about it. The water was warm and inviting. He had done this plenty of times. He could return to the ship in seconds, his hat retrieved, the day carrying on as if nothing had happened. The moment his body hit the water, he felt the difference. On the boat, the sea had seemed still, almost tranquil. But in the water, it was alive, moving around him, pressing against his skin with a silent, unrelenting presence. He kicked forward, reaching for the hat as it drifted beyond his grasp. Then, without warning, the water erupted. A force struck his leg like a sledgehammer, a sudden crushing grip that sent shockwaves of pain shooting through his entire body. His mind barely had time to process what was happening before he was yanked downward, water rushing over his head as he was dragged below the surface. Instinct kicked in, pure animal panic surging through his veins. His arms flailed, his body twisted, but the grip on his leg only tightened. A deep, wrenching pressure tore through him as the bull shark's teeth buried deeper, mercilessly sawing into flesh and bone. Once so clear, the water clouded instantly with a bloom of deep red swirling around him like ink spilled in a current. His chest burned, his lungs screaming for air as he fought against the relentless force pulling him down. He tried to kick, but the pain was blinding, white-hot and searing, his muscles refusing to respond. The bull shark twisted violently, a brutal primal motion meant to rip and tear. His body followed the motion unwillingly, his leg wrenching in a way no human body was meant to bend. Above, the surface shimmered, tauntingly close yet impossibly far. The world above continued as if nothing had changed. The same golden light filtering through the water, the same lazy swells rolling past. But down here in the depths, it was a different world governed by instinct and hunger. His fingers clawed at the water, desperate for something to hold or anchor himself to. The pain in his leg was unbearable now, waves of agony rolling through him with each thrash of the beast that held him. His mind fought to focus, to cling to something other than the mind-numbing terror threatening to consume him. Then a flash of movement. Something splashed above. His friend Mark throwing a life preserver. The bright orange ring cut through the water, bobbing just feet away. The sight sent a surge of adrenaline through Carl's veins, pushing back the creeping edges of unconsciousness. He reached for it, straining with every ounce of strength left in his battered body. The bull shark responded instantly. Another violent shake, another wrenching twist, and the world spun around him. Something tore, a deep, sickening rip before the grip on his leg loosened. He kicked instinctively, his body thrashing toward the surface, lungs burning for air. But the water was thick now, filled with the metallic scent of his blood. His movements were sluggish, his body heavy. The surface, so agonizingly close, shimmered just beyond his reach. His fingers stretched toward it, grasping for something solid, something real. Then another force, a second impact, a sharp tug pulled him back. The bull shark hadn't given up. It struck again, jaws clamping onto what remained of his leg, dragging him down with renewed fury. The last of his breath exploded from his lungs in a silent scream as he was yanked into the depths once more. The world grew darker, the light above fading as his strength bled away. His vision blurred, his thoughts scattering like leaves caught in a storm. The pain dulled, a distant, almost disconnected sensation now. His arms, once flailing, slowed, his body surrendering to the inevitable pull of the deep. Above, the boat drifted, the life preserver floating uselessly on the surface. The ocean swallowed the last ripples of the struggle, smoothing over as if nothing had happened. An hour later, the Coast Guard arrived. The boat rocked gently in the afternoon breeze. Mark standing at the edge, staring at the empty water. The search was swift and efficient but fruitless. There was no sign of Carl, nobody, no movement beneath the surface. Only remnants remained. Shreds of fabric drifted in the water, pieces of a shirt torn apart by the struggle. A single smear of blood stained the waves, slowly dissipating with the tide. And there, floating eerily on the surface, was Carl's hat. It bobbed in the water as if waiting, unaware its owner would never reach for it again.